and I call this meeting of the Rules and Bylaws Committee back to order. As Mignon described to you this morning, we will now discuss the waiver process and propose a package of states to receive waivers of Rule 12A. Right before we get to that, though, I want to comment, and we will return to this after we deal with the waivers, that we will be considering and proposing instructions for the next Rules and Bylaws Committee to begin this very in-depth process again for 2028 as soon as they are constituted, with a timeline and letters of intent and all of that we did this time to get broad participation and full consideration that does not just say because it's always been done that way. That was intended to make a record, and I think it just did. Okay. To describe the waivers that we will propose, I'd like to turn to our counsel, Graham Wilson, to walk us through the drafted language.
Thank you, Chair. So the waiver, as a reminder to the members of the committee, the way that our rule works is that all of the state parties are required to hold their primaries during our window after the first Tuesday in March, on or after the first Tuesday in March, and before the second Tuesday in June. We adopted a rule in our delegate selection rules saying that this committee could approve waivers subject to the ratification of the full DNC to allow states to go before the window. The co-chairs will have a motion before you shortly, the text of which you have in front of you, to grant waivers to South Carolina, Nevada, New Hampshire, Georgia, and Michigan. The way that these waivers work is that they will specify a date certain that each one of those states needs to hold a state-run primary before the window. In order to ensure that the states are taking the necessary steps in order to match their process to the waivers that we have granted them, we are making these waivers on a contingent basis. You need to meet the requirements of the waiver in order for the waiver to be effective and in order to be able to hold your primary prior to the window. We want to make sure, given that all of these waivers are subject to ratification of the DNC, that the states are all taking the necessary steps to hold their primaries on the dates that we have approved them to hold their dates on prior to the DNC meeting that will happen in February. Accordingly, each one of these waivers will specify a requirement for what the state party needs to do in order to assure this committee that they are taking the steps to hold their primary on the correct date before we reconvene and provide the waivers to the DNC for approval. Given the differences in state law for each one of these states that you are considering giving waivers to, the requirement, the contingencies are different for each state. So for example, for South Carolina, the date of the primary is determined by the party chair. And in New Hampshire, it is set by state law. Nevada, it is set by state law. Georgia, it is established by the Secretary of State. And Michigan, it is established by state law. So for each one of these states, we will require that by January 5th, 2023, that they provide certification or an information back to this committee showing that they are taking those steps. Between now and January 5th, each state needs to take the steps to set its primary date on the date that we are granting them a waiver for. If they don't take those steps, if they don't meet the requirements to give us the necessary certifications by January 5th, the waivers are automatically null and void, and those states are thus required to go in the window with every other state. Chairman, happy to elaborate on any of the other details that you or any of the committee members have questions on.
So, right thing here. Are there any questions for Graham? Hearing none, Mignon and I move a resolution which will be displayed on the screen, which grants waivers to Rule 12A, conditional upon the outlined stipulations for a state-run primary in South Carolina on February 3, 2024. New Hampshire and Nevada on February 6, Georgia on February 13, and Michigan on February 27. Is there any further discussion? Mr. McDonald.
Jim, it may be worth mentioning some of the conditions, and in particular, I think emphasizing the president's emphasis on expanding access to voting in some of these states is worth mentioning.
Yeah. Please, Graham, would you?
Absolutely. Thank you, David. So all of the states that are being considered have robust, no-excuse early voting in place, with the exception of New Hampshire, which does have absentee voting, but only with a certain limited excuses. So in addition to taking the steps necessary to show that the state is moving their date to the date we've identified by January 5th, in New Hampshire, you will see that there is an additional contingency in our waiver, which also requires the state to expand access to early voting in accordance with the values that this committee has discussed all cycle in terms of providing ample opportunities for early voting and participation in our process. The other piece of the contingent waivers that you will see in all 5 of these waivers are that any of the early states are required to provide base voter file access to any presidential campaign at an amount no more than $10,000 to ensure that every campaign, diverse campaigns, new candidates have an ability, just like more established campaigns, to get access to the party's voter file and fully participate in the system.
Any further questions for Graham? Yes, Ms. Fowler.
Thank you. I'm Carol Fowler from South Carolina. I want to say first that I intend to vote for this proposal because my chair has asked me to. And to say that South Carolina Democrats are honored to be in the first position. I do want to put on the record, though, that I'm not satisfied with the notion that it is helpful to our process to have 3 primaries in a 3 or 4 day period. Otherwise, I'm with you.
Thank you. Mr. Brennan.
Scott Brennan, Iowa. Obviously, I've made my position known on the makeup of the calendar, but I would just suggest that I think my good friend Mrs. Fowler has laid it out well. I think that this proposal impossibly truncates the process on the front end and really reduces the power of the 3 states that have been selected for those spots. And so I would be mindful of the fact as a committee that the pre-window process was designed to produce strong presidential candidates who were able to compete in multiple places. By jamming the 3 of these together in such a tight time frame, you've created a possibility of an impossible process. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Okay. Yes, Ms. Dowdell.
I would just add that by having the first 3 states within a 3 or 4 day window also limits the candidate's ability. One of the things that New Hampshire is known for is our retail politics, and candidates having the opportunity to engage the electorate face to face. By having 3 states, one on top of the other, I think causes a little bit of conflict for candidates trying to vie for the attention, get name recognition, and also raise money. The early window is, that's the genesis of these campaigns, and many of the candidates are not funded at that point. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Yes, Ms. Blanco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank you all as our chairs of the committee for the work that has been put together, to the staff of the committee for the work that has been put together, and to all my colleagues on the committee for all the work that we have done on this. And Nevada truly appreciates the accommodation that has been made. While not ideal to be on the same day as another state, we accept that and accept what the will of the president is, and that is what we are here to do for this committee at this moment. So I appreciate it, and Nevada is in support of these recommendations.
Thank you, Ms. Blanco. Any further discussion? Yes.
Luis Heredia, Arizona. I want to echo the support of doing what this committee is about to do, is set forth a calendar, and with the hope and commitment of looking at 2028 as another opportunity to evaluate what we can do for our country with the lineup of these states. Arizona would not have 2 Democratic senators, a Democratic governor, a Democratic Secretary of State, a Democratic Attorney General, if it wasn't because of the impact of Nevada organizers. Nevada learned how to teach the many states in the West, along with Colorado, how to transform these states from deep red states to actually having Democrats. And the same goes to South Carolina, the impact to Georgia. And these neighboring states have this contagious opportunity, and I think this window really opens up the door of diversifying not only the calendar, but the staff that gets hired, the folks that impact our Democratic Party to win major elections. And I do strongly support that we continue this reevaluation in 2028 as a means to what else can we do for the country with this lineup. So we are finally putting, I think, the commitments of what is in our credo, in our bylaws, in our charter, to actually be, diversify not only the body of the DNC, but also how we elect the President of the United States. So strongly supportive, but I really hope that the commitment about 2028 is very much a part of this motion.
That's why I wanted to get it on the record, and it's not a part of this motion. It's going to be a separate resolution following this motion. It is. Let me just say that it is great, not just here, but in other places like Georgia, to see organizers acknowledged for what they've accomplished for the democratic process. And congratulations, Artie. Any further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, I think we're ready to move to a vote on this motion. We'll start with a voice vote. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay.
Nay.
Would those who said nay like to be recorded by name?
Joanne Dowdell.
Mr. Brennan, you are recorded as a nay vote. Any others?
Joanne Dowdell, New Hampshire.
Ms. Dowdell, you are recorded as a nay vote. Anybody else? I'm going to take everybody else who is present as a yay vote, excuse me, a yay vote. So the yays clearly have it, and congratulations to all of us. The resolution has been adopted, and I will turn back to you, Mignon, for other committee business.
Yes. Thank you all for all the hard work again. We will now move to consideration of the regulations of the Rules and Bylaws Committee. This,
Before we
the-
do that.
yes, the chairman,
We have
sorry.
you might call it a point of personal privilege, but it's actually something that co-chairs are very anxious to hear from Mr. McDonald.
I won't repeat my comments from this morning with respect to the need to continue looking at our calendar and the fact that we haven't solved a problem. We've simply started to look more seriously at changes that happen in the country. There's a limit to what this committee can do in terms of 2028 because we dissolve at the fall meeting in 2025. But I would like to move that I would like to move that preliminary applications for 2028 early state status must be received by the Rules and Bylaws Committee prior to the fall 2025 DNC meeting, which will enable this committee to gather interest to find out if there are enough states who want to change things and give to the next committee some indication of what the land is like, so that the next committee can tweak the process that we set up this time to be appropriate to the number of states that are interested. But to tell the states now, be thinking about it. Don't be surprised when you get a notice that you have 30 days to apply. You can be thinking about it now if you want to.
So, Mr. McDonald, I'd like to suggest that you consider a friendly amendment to make that before the first DNC meeting of 2020, before the second DNC meeting of 2026, so that it goes directly to the new committee. So this committee will be on record about the process, but the actual receipt of applications or preliminary notice would begin with the new committee.
So the second, unless my years are off, doesn't the new committee come in the fall of 2025, not the fall of 2026?
Yes, so it
I mean,
could
I
be
will-
the first DNC meeting of 2026, yes.
All right, so that they would actually be received by the new.
Be received by the new committee,
Yeah.
yes.
Well,
The new committee is elected at the first meeting in 2025
So we would hand the letters
So
over.
it actually could be by the second meeting of the DNC in 2025.
That's what the motion is the fall meeting in 2025.
Strike everything I just said.
Well, I was going to say that the parliamentarian would advise me that a friendly amendment's not in order, but I was going to take it
Well,
as
I
an.
know that, but.
I was going to take it as an amendment from a friend, and I was going to.
Right.
Going to
But if
revise
that
it.
is,
We'll leave
if
it the way it
that-
is.
If that is how it currently reads, that does what I hope to accomplish.
Do you need, after all the
I just want
byplay?
those applications to come to the new committee. I just know that there's always a risk that something that was, first of all, put in place by the old committee and then enacted by the old committee gets forgotten by the new committee.
After all the byplay, do you need me to restate the motion?
Couldn't hurt.
Yeah. I move that preliminary applications for 2028 early state status must be received by the Rules and Bylaws Committee prior to the fall 2025 DNC meeting.
The second meeting is the second. All right, I'm actually going to interrupt again. The chair, who is elected at the first meeting of 2025, officers are elected at the first meeting of 2025. The chair appoints his committee members at the second meeting of 2025. So I'm going to ask you to amend that to the first meeting of 2026 so that it goes to the newly appointed committee. That's where I was trying to go, and I got, as we've done a few times here messed up on the dates.
Yeah, all right. I will restate the motion.
Okay.
Ask my seconder to withdraw her second, and I'll submit a new motion. Move that the preliminary applications for 2028 early state status must be received by the Rules and Bylaws Committee prior to the first meeting of the DNC in 2026.
That's correct.
Is there a second? There is a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. And that is unanimous among those present here. All right. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over. Yes, Mr. Leone?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could clarify what the potential penalties are for states that don't comply with the calendar rules that we've set out in our rules and that we've been discussing today.
So you're talking about the rules in the waivers, or?
I think I'm talking about just the general penalties if states don't comply with our
Yes, so there's a variety of them. I'm going to turn to Graham to summarize some of them anyway.
Happy to do so. So if you don't comply with the conditions of the waiver, you don't have a waiver, and you are not allowed to go before the window, right? So that's kind of step one. You don't follow the conditions, you then are obligated to go during the window with every state party. If then a state moves to go outside of the window because they don't have a waiver, our rules, the delegate selection rules, really clearly specify what happens. Excuse me. And this is Rule 21 of the delegate selection rules. First, any state that is going outside of the window automatically loses half their delegates. In addition, this committee strengthened those rules this cycle so that candidates are precluded from campaigning in any state that goes outside the window. And campaigning includes putting your name on the ballot in that state. Any candidate that violates that rule and puts their name on the ballot or campaigns in a state that is violating the windows receives no pledged delegates or delegate votes from that state. In addition, we also, I believe at our last meeting, could have been 2 meetings ago, made it clear in those rules that the national chair is also empowered to take any other appropriate steps to enforce these rules. That aren't just, for example, that could go beyond merely having the delegate stripped to other authorities within the purview of the DNC chair. So there are a number of delegate selection and other penalties which would immediately go into effect if a state were to not receive a waiver and then also go outside the window.
So in the past, when these have been considered, sometimes in this category, one thing is placement on the floor. That's sometimes constrained by the size of the delegation. But something that is not constrained is there are hotels 40 miles away from the convention site. Mr. McDonald.
I just want to add one additional comment. The penalties that Graham described are automatic and don't require a vote of the DNC. You lose half your delegates without us taking any action, but in practice, we are highly likely to take away the rest of the delegates with an actual vote, depending on the state. That's what happened in 2008, because if a state is large enough, half of its delegates is still a big chunk of delegates. So for larger states, we might well take away the rest of the delegates.
Go beyond the automatic.
Yeah, we're not, we've always had that option. That's what happens without any vote at all, and then we have the option to take away the rest if we think it's appropriate.
Record is intended to restrict that, yes.
And I think actually, sure, the rules specify that the committee is not bound just by those penalties, but the committee clearly has the authority to take any other remedial steps as needed to enforce the calendar rules that it's adopted.
Any further questions or discussion? Ms. Fowler.
I think we talked about this in an earlier meeting, and I've just forgotten. if a candidate does not put his name on the ballot, but a state party or a Secretary of State or somebody and I think there are states where this is possible to do, adds that candidate's name to the ballot, what happens then?
You can answer that.
Yep. It is Rule 21C1B, which talks about the definition of campaigning. And it includes, and a candidate is not allowed to campaign in a state that is going outside the window. And campaigning is defined to include placing your name on the ballot or failing to take action to remove it from the ballot.
But it clearly also includes the standard definition of campaigning, actually giving speeches and doing anything in that state other than national fundraising appeals.
That's absolutely right. It's, in addition to having your name on the ballot, it's purchasing print, internet, or electronic advertising, hiring campaign workers, opening an office, making public appearances, holding news conferences. All of the normal things we associate with campaigning are prohibited for a candidate if a state is going outside the window.
Any other questions or discussion? Hearing and seeing none, now I will turn it over to Co-Chair Moore.
And I'm going to turn it back over to our chair who has a statement he wants to make.
Yep. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you so much, Mignon. And again, I want to thank all of you, the members of this very, very important committee of the Democratic National Committee. I want to thank you all for all of your hard work. You know, we knew that it was a priority that this be reflective of the values of the Democratic Party, which is embodied by our President of the United States, Joe Biden, and our Vice President, Kamala Harris. I continue, my friends, to be impressed by the level of commitment and the thoughtfulness we've seen throughout this process, including the respectful conversation we saw here today. When we started this process over a year ago, we knew how important it was to approach it with a clear framework and to have a thorough and transparent process. And I believe that we have delivered upon that. From the onset, I decided that I was going to let this process play out, that I wasn't going to be heavy-handed, and I was going to allow this committee to do what this committee does all so well, particularly Jim and Mignon, to allow you all to do your work without any involvement or very little involvement from the chair's office. My job as chair of this party is to fight for all of our state parties, all 57 state parties in our territories as well, which I've tried to consistently demonstrate, and I hope each of our state parties and our state party chairs and vice chairs and all of DNC members know that I try that each and every day. And folks, I am so proud of all of our state parties and their presentations that they made before this committee. This has been an emotional process, and it's been emotional particularly for friends that I've had since I've been involved with the DNC. But I just want to say thank you to all of you, because even despite the raw emotions, we have carried ourselves in the most dignified manner that I've ever seen. You know, I actually did not find out that President Biden was recommending South Carolina to be the first in the nation until last evening at the state dinner. I didn't have my phone. I just bought a new iPhone. And so my wife likes the camera on this iPhone. And so she had my phone all evening long. And when I was getting calls from staff, she was not answering them because she said I didn't need my phone because we were at the state dinner. And finally, Jen O'Malley Dillon, President, my friend and my colleague, found me in the room. I was stuffing my mouth with a shrimp. And she said, "Have you heard?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "The president is recommending South Carolina to be first in the South." Folks, I was emotional. You all know how much I love my state. You all know how much I love this party and what this party has done for me. But you also know how much I love Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Folks, as a South Carolinian, I am, of course, the first black chair of that state party. I'm honored that my home state is a part of this process. Earlier, I shed tears when seen folks that aren't heard, folks that have not always been valued, folks who grow up and live on dirt roads, folks that don't have fancy college degrees, folks who live from paycheck to paycheck, people like my grandparents. My grandma had an 8th grade education. She picked cotton and cleaned houses. My grandfather, a 4th grade ed. Sorry for being so emotional, folks. Society called folks like my grandparents simple people and don't always value them, don't always cherish them, don't always give them their roses. But in my eyes, my grandparents are the wealthiest people I've ever known. Because they're rich in terms of their values. Hardworking people like Artie's parents. Good America. These people have often been forgotten. Many times voiceless and voteless. And voteless. Particularly those in states like South Carolina. I don't know if you all know this. South Carolina is a state where 40% of enslaved people came through the port of Charleston. 40% of enslaved people. You can go anywhere in this country, you talk to black folks, and I guarantee this is a place where Briggs versus Elliott, and some of you may not know that, you know Brown versus Board, but the first case about desegregation was Briggs versus Elliott in Summerton, South Carolina. Thurgood Marshall came to talk about that. States like Nevada, where Latinos have been building their political power and lifting their voices. Michigan, Georgia, where the phoenix of the New South has risen from the ashes of the Old South. A New South that is bold, that is inclusive, that is diverse. Reflecting all of our diverse and progressive values. And New Hampshire, continuing the tradition, the great tradition here in America, that small government is good government. Small government by the people and for. Biden will reflect the strength of America's greatest asset. And that is our diversity. This proposal reflects the best of our party as a whole, and it will continue to make our party and our country stronger. And it will elevate the voices who are the backbone of the party. This was a process and decision that we can all be proud of. The Democratic Party is the party of hope. This is the leadership that we have seen every minute of the Joe Biden presidency. He made a promise to this country when he ran for the presidency. And he has been working hard to keep that promise. first black woman ever on the Supreme Court, most diverse cabinet in the history of this nation. And this proposal continues in that tradition, my friends. I'm grateful for the work of this committee, and I'm proud of the work that you have done. As always, I am proud to be a Democrat, but I am even prouder to be an American. Thank you all so much for what you have done today. Thank you for the continued work, and thank you for always fighting for the Democratic Party.
Yes, please. Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chair, thank you very much for those wonderful words, but thank you especially for sharing your emotion with us. It's very, very important for us to realize the impact. I see the impact on others around this table as well, some of whose, almost all of whose families at one point shared a great experience, but yours is the most moving that I've heard, and I really appreciate it.
Well, I guess I have to follow that. And I'm certainly emotional myself here, but I would just like to add, Mr. Chairman, I thought I heard you say that the president recommended that South Carolina be first in the South. The president recommended that South Carolina be the first primary in the nation. That's what he recommended. So I just want to state that for the record. So now we'll move on to Regulations and the Rules and Bylaws Committee. This document supplements the delegate selection rules and the call for the convention. It also includes our rules of procedure, the procedures for submitting and considering state plans, and the process for challenges before the Convention Credentials Committee is in place. The copy of the proposed regulations in your folders reflect changes recommended by the co-chairs and staff. As well, Jenna will be projecting on this screen so everyone can follow along. We will proceed by reviewing each regulation individually. We'll introduce each regulation and run through the proposed changes for 2020 regulations. The floor will be open for RBC members to discuss. This is a deliberative process, and we encourage members to ask questions and give us thoughts on the proposed changes. I'm sure I didn't have to state that, but I thought it would be just good for you all to hear that. After we've considered all of the regulations, we will vote on them as amended. Are there any questions on how we should proceed? With no further questions, let's proceed to the consideration of the regulations. The chair will now entertain a motion before discussion to adopt the regulations of the rules and bylaws as drafted and presented today. So moved. Is it?
And then we'll do discussion after.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there a motion?
Is there a motion?
To proceed to consideration of the regulations.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Is there a second? Thank you.
Actually proceed to adoption of the regulations, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
That's what we, yeah. With a motion on the floor, we will begin our review of the regulations.
So Regulation 1 outlines the rules of procedure for this Rules and Bylaws Committee. In Regulation 1.4, we have proposed removing the phrase "in person or by proxy" to allow for virtual meetings and votes. We're updating Regulation 1.5 to provide for an RBC member to co-preside in the absence of one chair, rather than only in the case of both chairs being absent. Regulation 1.6 is updated to provide for virtual meetings and for votes to occur over email or mail rather than in person, which will also be provided for by our change in Regulation 1.4. Any discussion of Regulation 1? If not, we'll move on to Regulation 2.
So Regulation 2 refers to the submission and review of delegate selection plans. The draft before you contains several proposed housekeeping changes. Regulation 2.1, oh, I'm sorry, could you hear me? Regulation 2.1 is a new addition. As we've done throughout the year, we've tried to proceed with caution as we've made some big changes. So as we embark with a newly determined early window and many new leaders in the state parties, we are requesting letters of intent from all state parties by March 1st. This will allow us to set up an early system to support the development of plans as well as flag any issues for the committee preemptively. Regulation 2.2M is an addition to the regulations meant to reflect what we've heard from members regarding voter file access. Members spoke so frequently about the need to provide equitable and affordable access to candidates early on that we asked applicants whether they would be in support of providing the voter file in the state to candidates for a reasonable amount, in this case, $10,000. Overwhelmingly, states agreed that this was a reasonable provision and made clear that their support was not just to encourage presidential candidates, but to strengthen the entire democratic infrastructure. So, we added this regulation to make clear that the terms outlined in the waiver you approved earlier today. Regulation 2.4 specifies the process should a state party require more time. Rather than require a chair to submit a formal letter, we've adjusted the regulation to allow the co-chairs or their designee to extend the deadlines, which will also allow us a measure of flexibility as we navigate the challenges of the early window. Regulation 2.7A now includes the phrasing of or 4 months before the respective state's first determining step, whichever is earlier, to align this regulation with the language of the previously passed rule. Regulation 2.7C has been edited to add, in reviewing submitted plans in noncompliance, the RBC may grant waivers, impose sanctions, or take corrective action contemplated in the Rule 21C. This does not add new courses of action, but confirms past practice of the ability of the committee to act under Rule 21C. Is there any discussion from the members? Do we see any hands? No? If there's no more discussion or no discussion, we will move to consideration of Regulation 3.
Regulation 3 deals with the general terms of challenges. We have drafted several changes to this section to simplify the challenge process. As you know, there are instances where a decision about a challenge needs to come to the entire RBC. The changes in this section are made to reflect this past practice, which is that not every challenge that comes before the RBC necessitates a detailed fact-finding endeavor. Only a subset of instances requires a larger fact-finding hearing, and the purpose of these changes provides us the flexibility to address matters in this fashion. Regulation 3.4F addresses the review of challenges. We've updated it to include a section which states the co-chairs shall have the authority to adjust the timelines, deadlines, and technical procedures set forth herein as most appropriate and required by the circumstances of an individual challenge to account for any specific remedial measures needed to address a challenge. Regulation 3.4.G.3 sounds like an IP address, okay. Clarifies that a challenge may be dismissed if it is not a valid challenge under the requirements provided for within the regulations, solely as a housekeeping change. Regulation 3.4 I has been updated to allow for the co-chairs to determine if a factual hearing is necessary, and also allows the co-chairs, rather than just a designated hearing officer, to call for a pre-hearing conference in the hopes of streamlining the challenge process. Regulation 3.4.J has been updated according to the change in 3.4.I to specify that a hearing may or may not be deemed necessary, and specifies that a hearing does not need to occur. If a hearing does not need to occur, it will be done so under the guidelines, that if a hearing does need to occur, it will be done so under the guidelines provided for in Section J. Regulation 3.4.K has been updated to allow for virtual meetings. Regulation 3.4.L simplifies the request for consideration by the full committee for filing a petition for review and clarifies a path to full consideration of the RBC if there is not a hearing. We have removed the provision in 3.4.M.3 small i's, which requires a significant number of briefs for the RBC. I will now open the floor to any discussion from the members. Hearing none, I will move back to Co-Chair Moore for discussion of Regulation 4.
Thank you, Jim. Regulation addresses the implementation of the 2024 delegate selection rules as passed by the full DNC in September. We added Regulation 4.4.B in recognition of the fact that some states have ballot fees ascribed to those running for delegate on the ballot. An example, a two-party primary. This is because Rule 2.2D prevents fees related to participating in the delegate selection process, and while Rule 15.D in past versions of the rules limited the amount a delegate or an alternate could be assessed to be on the ballot, we removed 15.D. This cycle, as the majority of it was redundant and related to candidate fees. After removing it, there was not a rule related to delegate fees for being on the ballot, and Regulation 4.4 makes it so fees from state government do not invalidate a state party's delegation selection plan. We made changes in 4.9.A and B to use more appropriate gendered language consistent with our other rules. In Regulation 4.14, we removed the provision that a voting member of the DNC must be registered to vote with their respective state. David McDonald had suggested this would preclude those with felony records or other factors, and the purpose of this regulation is achieved by the provision that one must legally reside within their respective state. Under Regulation 4.17, we removed the reference to Rule 10.8.3, as we removed it from the rules in this cycle and updated 4.17.A to reflect the language in Rule 10.A. The floor is now open for discussion. Yes, David.
We have a Regulation 4.29 that I'm not sure is really necessary. It says, in states using a caucus system for their delegate selection process, presidential preference must be determined at the first step in the process. And it's citing to Rule 14B, but we've actually already said in the actual rules themselves in 2K5 that in states that use party processes, they have to require that the allocation of all delegates national delegates be locked in at the final expression of preference at the first determining step as determined by the state's plan, subject to recount. I actually find the language of the rule clearer than I find the regulation, and I'm wondering if we can just delete 4.29 rather than have the wording in there.
That makes sense to me. So let's amend this recommendation to remove Regulation 4.29 relating to Rule 14B.
And then I don't want to propose language or anything, but it seems to me we have what's a pretty clear statement in Rule 2K5, but it might be read to only apply to party-run processes, but we're going to be dealing with states potentially that have other forms of multiple expressions of preference in government primaries. And am I correct that we would apply the same standard to those? That this rule basically is going to apply to everything,
Yes,
no matter where it's
yes,
located?
you are.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yes. So there's a motion on the floor to delete?
Okay?
Yes, motion
so
to delete
There's a
4.29.
motion in the form of an amendment to delete this provision. Mr. Leone, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was just wondering why it was in there in the first place. Presumably it serves some sort of purpose. I don't know if we changed a rule so it no longer serves a purpose, or if we're trying to achieve some other goal.
I'm not well, there's other language that accomplishes this purpose. I'm not sure whether that other language existed at the time this regulation was put in here or not.
I think the 2K5 language came in after the Unity Reform Commission when we did a whole bunch of reforms of the caucus process, and we put that language in, Frank. I think the reg predated the language that I read, that's all.
Artie, you're indicating that's your recollection as well?
Yes, it was Artie Blanco, Nevada. It was in regards to our three-tier process, three-step process in a sense, in a caucus state. Previously, Nevada had allowed that there was one or a couple positions that could be set at a county at the second step, and that was a result of 2016, so it was changed for 2020. So this language was after a recommendation of the Unity Commission to adjust that particular.
And so therefore you would say this is no longer necessary?
It's no longer, not for Nevada, it's no longer necessary, no, sir.
Frank, are you satisfied with that?
No.
Why?
Because I think David's trying to pull a fast one.
That expression of...
I am shocked, that you would think that.
That personal attack will be deleted from the record.
Whoops. Thank you, sorry. I mean, David, is your thought that taking this out would facilitate ranked choice voting?
Oh.
No, my thought is that taking this out would do nothing because it's already covered by a language in the rule, and the regulation can't override the rule. Deleting this has no effect on ranked choice voting. So.
Okay. Now I'm satisfied.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Boylan, as usual, has just clarified that for me by showing me where the language was moved to. So that's fine. Okay. So we need to vote on that motion to amend. Any further discussion? All those in favor say.
Back to you, Jim.
Yeah,
Further
thanks.
discussion.
We will move to Regulation 5, which addresses the call for the 2024 Democratic National Convention, which was adopted by the DNC in September. For Regulation 5.1, which defines regions for the purpose of bonus delegates, we removed the explanatory prefaces to simplify each section. In Regulation 5.3.a, we clarified that the election reference is the general election. Hearing none, back to you, Mignon.
Okay. So we're going to Appendix A. Appendix A addresses the methods a state party can use to allocate district-level delegates among the state's districts as provided in Rule 8.a. There are no proposed changes to this appendix. Is there any discussion from RBC members?
To allocate district-level delegates by proportional representation as required by Rule 14. You'll see that we only have a couple of minor corrections in the first paragraph and step 5, plus a gender reference update in step 6. Are there any questions or discussion? Hearing none, we have now completed our review of the regulations. We started our discussion.
We've specified that pages should be as evenly divided by gender as possible. And that is potentially problematic language that might suggest something along the lines of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. I think what we meant was should be as equally divided as possible. Because we have elsewhere defined what equal division is as being a difference between men and women no more than one. The concept of gender begins to get a little bit more expansive.
So
these pages shall be as equally divided as possible.
yes. So you're basically proposing to amend out the word evenly and in the word equally.
Right, and not insert the words by gender.
And remove the words by gender.
What
Yeah,
does
I'm not sure we
evenly
have a term
divided
yet
mean?
in English for by gender or non-gender. So, Carol.
If there are other ways to evenly divide things, so I mean, or race, ethnicity, what? I think we have to specify what we are evenly, how we are evenly dividing.
Maybe you're right. As I was searching for a word, maybe we need to go with a few words and say by.
That was the reason why I wanted to change the term evenly divided to be equally divided, because equally divided is defined in both the charter and in our rules as applying to the allocation of delegates between men and women. When you say evenly divided, it raises the questions that you just raised, but when we substitute equally divided, we can refer back to our definitions.
It's a defined term. Yeah. Okay, so the motion is to strike evenly. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Opposed, no. And the ayes have it. So, we have now completed our review of the regulations. We started our discussion with a motion to approve the regulations of the Rules and Bylaws Committee as amended today.
Yes, sir.
We will direct staff to make any typographical or similar edits that are discovered. Is there any further discussion before we move to a vote? Hearing none, we'll move to that vote. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. And the ayes have it.
I just had a question. So when we adopt the regulations, that's the end of, the regulations are adopted. They don't need to be further adopted by the DNC, is that right?
The regulations are adopted by this committee.
All right, just want to
The
clarify.
rules that the regulations implement are adopted by the full DNC. Correct. Right. Have been, yes.
You're going to get a handout from the staff. It's the model plan. So next on our agenda is consideration of the model plan. As you may know, the RBC prepares a model plan that states may use when preparing their delegate selection plans. We provide this model plan to states because we recognize that we require a lot of information from the state parties about their process as a part of our assessment of their delegate selection process. This model, but it is not required. Using the model helps make sure everything is included in the state plans. The model plan you have is a draft. Staff will update the model to reflect the changes to the regulations adopted today. We don't normally take a vote to adopt the model plan. It's treated as an administrative function. However, if you have any suggestions about the model plan or see something that could be improved or may not be of the model plan in your folder, but it looks like it's being handed out, and Jenna will project the plan on the screen as we go through the document. Many of you are familiar with the general layouts we use in this model plan. This document attempts to include the various options available to state parties for their various steps in the process. And in many cases, we're asking the state party to provide us with a description or details about how their process complies with the top line, but please feel free to let us know if you have any questions as we go through the plan. The model plan is set up with some macros in the first couple of pages that makes it easy for certain basic information about the state and the process to be populated through the plan. Jim will go to section 1.
So section 1 of the model plan provides an overview and determining step. We have a section on voter participation that provides information about party registration and participation in the process. That is essentially how the state complies with Rule 2. Section 2 describes what presidential candidates must do to participate in the state's process. Section 3 deals with the selection of delegates and alternates. It walks us through the state's review process, the proportional allocation of delegates to candidates based on the state's election results, and the steps necessary to ensure equal division of the delegates and alternates if the state is also electing alternates at the district level. This section also includes a description of the automatic delegates and confirms that these delegates are counted as part of the total number of delegates, delegate positions, the so-called PLEOs, the presidential candidate review process, and how these delegate positions are apportioned to the candidates based on the statewide results and how the PLEOs are selected. This section further sets out the process for selecting the at-large delegates and alternates. covers how the at-large delegates and alternate candidates file, the presidential candidate review process. Category will be used if necessary to help the state achieve the demographic goals included in the state's affirmative action and outreach and inclusion plan. And finally, this section provides information about how delegates and alternates are replaced on a temporary or permanent basis, and how permanent replacements are certified to the secretary, so that we have an accurate record of who is qualified to vote at the national. Their selection of delegates late in the process will describe how they will select temporary standing committee members to ensure they have representation if committees meet before the state selects the regular members. All states will provide information as to when their delegates will meet to select the standing committee members, how these members are apportioned to the presidential candidates, and the list of the deadline by which the candidates must provide their lists, committee, by preference, and overall. Section 5 delineates where the delegation will select the delegation chair, when the delegation will select the delegation chair, and when the state chair will name the convention pages. Minya?
Thank you, Jim. Section 6 provides us with details about the state's presidential electors, how they are selected and certified, and how the state party will ensure that the procedural guidelines. Here's where we incorporate the 6 basic elements: are rules prohibiting discrimination, the good conscience rule, prohibiting of the unit rule, quorum requirements, proxy requirements, slate restrictions. Section 8 is the affirmative action plan and outreach and inclusion plan. We encourage state parties to be creative, their state-specific diverse communities and coalitions, to get them involved and active in this process and the party's operation. This section specifies the goals set by the state party for inclusion of our Democratic constituents based on the state's Democratic electorate. The DNC will also work with each state party to ascertain demographic composition of the state's Democratic electorate. In this, to inform them about this process. As well, this section describes the important role of the presidential campaigns play in helping maximize participation of our Democratic constituents, and how the campaigns will work with the state party toward meeting the representation goals. Section 9 outlines the process for filing challenges related to the test and includes a timetable that reflects when and what occurs in each step of the state's process. And finally, there is a section describing each of the documents the state party will need to provide to the Rules and Bylaws Committee as a part of our review process. With that overview, the floor is now open for any discussion or questions from members about the model plan.
6 presidential electors, it looked like it had a cite to the call section 8, which describes that, but it seems to be taken out. I was wondering why that cite was removed. It seems like you would want to keep that in.
Okay. I think the staff can make that update, Frank. Did they get it?
Would you repeat, repeat what you're?
Sure. It's Section 6, presidential electors, and it originally,
So section, yeah.
Okay. I think as we suggested before, if anybody notices any other inconsistencies, please let the staff know as soon as possible.
We just want to be mindful that sites can be hard to find during this.
That's why we ask staff to take a good hard look at it. Yes. What Veronica said is want to be mindful sites can be.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to reflect for a moment on Section 1, subsection C, 2 and 3. I just want to talk on behalf of all of the state party chairs present and most of them not present in this room today to say that while I understand the intention of these additional requirements, I want control in their state. They don't have the ability to effectuate change in any way, shape, or form, or consider even highly democratic states where the state party really has no relationship with their elected officials. This is a very, very heavy and time-consuming burden. It's not to say that state parties shouldn't be actively involved in all these measures. But I fail to see what it has to do with actually putting forth that helps protect voters' rights and helps ensure that we are living our values, of course. But I'm still unsure why we're tying it to the National Delegate Selection Plan, what it has to do with the actual election of delegates to our national convention. Most importantly, each year that I've been on this committee, there are members on this committee who continue to put additional burdens on state parties, many of them that do not have the staff to even comply with this. And so they spend their time, their energy. Just want to again remark that this is a very heavy burden for our state parties to carry.
Jenna, would you scroll to C2 and 3 just so we can see what Ken is referring to?
The voters are not registered and enrolled. Oh, it's 1, 2, and 3?
It's up a little the other way. Okay, so we have the deadline to register to vote, an overview of the state's voter registration and enrollment procedures. Yeah, will be allowed to participate in the delegate selection process. At no stage of the state's delegate selection process shall any person be required to pay a cost or fee. No person shall participate in the nominating process who also not of any other party. So I think this is applying to actions in the party-run delegate selection.
Letter C.
Okay.
Section 1. Letter C,
taking steps.
numeral 2,
okay, or to seek
where it says
amendment.
describe how the state party has taking steps or is taking steps to seek enactment of legislation, rules, and policies. That whole section, followed by section 3 there,
I see. Okay.
are related to legislation and related to ordinances and other things that state parties. I mean, look, I wish we had the type of power that some on this committee think we do to actually affect effectuate legislative change. You have us spending, sort of chasing the tail on this stuff. Look, we do this in our state. Yvette probably does it in her state. I'm sure Susan does it in her state. But there's a lot of state parties that can't. They don't have the staff to spend that time on this.
So
it's a heavy burden.
I think what we're asking state parties to do here is to be aware of these goals and to specify what they are able to do to meet them. To say that we, have made this our policy, but of the situation, and puts them on record. I think that's what this goes to.
And
Frank?
Before Frank goes, and I tell you, I'm sitting here reading this thing. I had to put these glasses down. But so voter and election security and combat election subversion, I mean, if nothing else, the state parties should be able to flag it to show that they have trouble in their states. Even if they can't pull it all together, just understanding what's happening in your state. So I just want to point that out. And Frank.
Yes, I agree with the chair's statements. I would point out that the delegate selection rules were already adopted. So this model plan is only reflecting the rules that we've already adopted. So we've already done that, and for the reasons that the chair stated. And what does it have to do with our delegate selection process? Well, we just passed a resolution on the waivers that conditioned the new democracy as a fundamental part of our delegate selection effort. So that's why it's there. I continue to respectfully disagree that it poses some sort of impossible burden on state parties, and certainly the DNC Voter Protection Department has made it clear that they are happy to work with states and help them to try to fulfill these goals.
So I think this is a guide to what can be recounted in narrative, and what we would hope by this being in the model plan, I don't think creates any disqualification. And I say that for the record. Susan?
Yeah. If I could just add in, and I appreciate the co-chair's comments on this and Frank's work on this. But what I would ask too, just to put it out there, is to be mindful of, Yvette and Ken and I have been around a while, but we have a lot of new chairs and new executive directors coming in January. So as someone who has sat on this committee and watched some state parties be beat up before on this, we need to prove positive steps and whatever, and what have you done? I think, to me, it would just help if we all generally agree that in the spirit of what Co-Chair Moore Mignon said, that, we're not here to be punitive. We are here, we understand your situation, and that, of course, we should be working to expand.
Always be very mindful of, and Carol always is, when she talks about state chairs and what we have to do. I know you didn't intend it this way, because I know you and I have a great relationship, Frank, but don't presume to say what state parties can and can't do if you have not been a state party chair, right? So don't presume to say what is a burden on a state party chair if you've not been a state party chair. And I know you didn't intend it that way, so that's, but that's what I heard. And when we have income, they were new. Right now, I'm facing central committees and Democrats in Maryland who for 8 years have had a Republican governor. We've got to have a whole attitude shift now Because just like we have Joe Biden as the head of the party now, I have Wes Moore as the head of the Democratic Party. I've worked as chair under a governor, but a lot of these people never have before. We've got serious learning curves that take place constantly because there's constant something that you feel is burdensome in some way, but just don't automatically assume that it's not burdensome to state party chairs when we have a heavy lift, and we're dealing with so many personalities, and I'm always so grateful, which is why I'm glad to be sitting by Carol, because she speaks up for state parties all the time, because you know what we're dealing with. So let me publicly thank you, but I just wanted to kind of put that on record.
So I'd like to point out, both factually and for the record, that the model plan is intended to be an assistance qualifier, and it's not a mandatory format. Ms. Daughtry, did you have something?
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chairman, you clarified for me. I just wanted to make sure I was clearly understanding that we've already passed the requirements.
Yes.
So this is just a means or a model by which the state parties may fulfill the requirements that we've already.
Yes, Luis.
Mr. Chair, Luis Heredia from Arizona, and as a former executive director of a state party, I completely understand. And having written the plan, having to collect data, and having to do the work to fulfill the DNC, I do want to do better. And this is not, I've said this before to this body, is that we achieve a lot of goals in our convention itself, and party chairs, to use the opportunity in the affirmative action plan to also share the election of state party chairs, of vice chairs, how the DNC members to the permanent national committee get elected as a vehicle for education. It is, you're talking to individuals that are new to the Democratic Party. Every 4 years, folks get very excited about being a delegate to the National Convention. It is a great opportunity for them to look at opportunity. I think should be very proud of our convention because there is a representation and it looks like America when you're in that room. But sometimes when I walk into the Arizona Democratic Party in our state party, it does not even feel like Arizona. In my opinion, I've worked really hard to try to encourage more participation, but it's about education and it's about involvement. It's about encouraging. I'm talking about folks that are new to being a part of a Democratic Party, to a political institution, and it takes heavy lifting. So use the vehicle of the convention to educate folks to how to also participate in all party affairs. I will not add any conditions or any things to the plan, but it is extremely important because when I walk into the permanent DNC, we are not reflective of what we see at the convention level. And I aspire to be that the DNC membership, the chairman of the Democratic Party does a great equalizer in their nominations to the reflective body. And so I just want to challenge our party to do better.
I think that's a very useful point. The chair's appointments are explicitly intended for that purpose, and someday, let's hope we don't need them. Yes.
And I just want to piggyback on something the Bishop said. Yes, this is, this has been approved and everything, but I still want us to be mindful of what state parties can do. And some state parties may not be. That's all I think that Ken was saying and that Susan was saying that I'm saying. So if that means that it's, you know, extra tutorial that we have to do with ASDC, you know, it might come to that, you know, as we have our meetings and working with chairs, especially new state party chairs. But I would just ask for a little bit of grace as we work through this in bringing other state party chairs up to speed with, you know, where we may already be. That's it.
Actually, I think this.
I just want to opening up pathways for leadership within our party. How are we bringing new voices in? That's what this should be used for. But to compel state parties to, many state parties aren't involved in the legislature. They're not involved in passing ordinances or laws. They're strictly involved in the process of running their party. And it's not to say they shouldn't be, Frank. They should be, but not every state party is equipped to do that. I think what Luis is talking about is the type of conversation we should be. Powerful rooms reflect who we are as a party. That is a deeper conversation that, frankly, does have something to do with legislation around voting rights, but not altogether. And I would say where we focus so much on voter protection and voting rights are things that are completely out of our hands in this room. None of us, well, some of us around here may be elected. I know there's a few folks who are elected to the legislature. You know, the senator here has more power than I do, and I've been a chair for 12 years. The party and the people involved reflect the values. And how are we actively recruiting and creating new pathways to leadership and involvement? That is exactly the conversation we need to have, Luis, and I'm happy to have that. And we've talked about that. But I will just go on the record again. Every single one of these under Section 2 and Section 3, while I understand the intent of it, are additional work that someone in the state party has to do. And where does this information go? Does it just sit on a shelf? What's done with the information? I mean, what is done with this information when someone on my staff has to go out and collect all this information and do it? That's the challenge here. There's a real life consequence and a cost to me in a state party to have to go and pursue this chase of information. And again, Frank, I understand this. I just want to go on the record once again, these are burdens to state parties that cost us money and time.
Frank?
51 state parties around the country to improve voting and help elect Democrats. That's where it goes. And you know, what this is more intended as a checklist for people who aren't familiar with the process. These are some of the things that people should be familiar with, be aware of. And to say a state party doesn't pay any attention to voting laws just strikes me as weird. I mean, I think how people vote is more important, to be aware of those issues. And that's all this does, and that's all it's done. And it's not punishing anybody for not doing anything. There is no history of any state party being punished in any way under these sections. It just brings to for the four important issues on voting rights, defending democracy, and there's a wonderful, wonderful DNC department that is
Pros and cons to this, but I do want to share a quick story, a positive story about the effectiveness of a state party. This summer, and it interrelates to this, but it doesn't relate, but it does relate. Okay, so let me just get to the story. This summer, we were engaging with Karen Bass, and Leah, Donna, and I had her on several conference calls. We discovered early on that the mail-in process for California, in particular Los Angeles, was very, very new. We reached out to her up with Karen's staff so that they could be trained and equipped to deal with the irregularities around mail-in votes. And so on one level, the party is really functioning very well, and to strengthen that and to suggest, as Yvette has said, that they continue to look at these guidelines, I think it's only healthy for the party. We get that it's a cumbersome process, but the result of a state party being very effective.
Yana, I just wanted to echo what you said, but also, Ken, I recognize that we might be placing more burdens on state parties and requesting this information, but also making sure that states are aware of some of the changes that are constantly going on in the voter protection space. And most recently, and I want to say to Chair Warnock led it, Reverend Raphael Warnock, Senator Warnock led it, but we backed it and supported, ensuring that we had early voting right after Thanksgiving. It matters that state parties are engaged, that Congresswoman Nikema Williams, the chair of the party, engaged. It matters. So I just want to thank the party for, and trust me, as former party chair, I mean, you know, when I used to look at the legal bills, close years, I should have been the lawyer, damn it. But when I looked at the results, whether it was in states like Arizona, whether it was in several of the southern states that we know we've had some problems since the Supreme Court decision and Holder v. Shelby v. Holder. I'm so glad that we do have a party that cares about voting rights and voter protection, but more important, station has been eliminated, or if it's been moved, it has been in large part because of our state parties that we have been notified of some of these changes. So I want to applaud the state parties for what you do. I know we put a lot of burden on you. I remember when I was chair, again, there was this little budget item. You know, I used to go over the budget all the time, and there was a budget item of how much money we provided to state parties. And by the time I left, Jamie, I know it went up a lot to what we're allocating the budget and the resources. We're also providing state parties with resources. And if in the future we got to do more, we got to do more. Ken, we got to do more. The right to vote is precious. The right of every citizen to participate in the election process is important. That is what we the people is all about. So I recognize the burden, but I support the efforts to ensure that our state parties are at the table helping us shape the future of our...
I want to clarify this because you and I are on the same page. Luis and I are on the same page. The reality is there's an assumption that state parties, there's some assumption here that state parties, based on my statement, don't care about voter protection. That's absolutely incorrect. I ran one of the largest voter protection programs of any state party. Spent millions of dollars. Most of our state parties do. Yvette does. Most state parties are engaged in that. That's separate from this national delegate selection plan. My problem is that there's an assumption just in this document alone that most state parties aren't heavily engaged with that are out there actually on the front lines protecting the rights to vote every day. We are. And almost every state party is engaged in that work. My only point on this is it seems to be a I'm not sure why it's in this document. And all this does is add more burden to, again, we're on the front lines with the investment that Jamie and others have made in the state parties. We're on the front lines protecting the right to vote. And I will tell you, I wish the DNC could do more. Yvette, who is the chair of our voter protection, that the state parties, or me as the president of the association, are saying we shouldn't be involved in voter protection work. Guess what? State parties are the ones that have to be because of the unique situation in each of our states. Guess what? I'm the only one that can put poll challengers into precincts throughout my state. State parties are the ones that have to be involved in this. So to suggest that they're not is not correct. What I am suggesting here is having a document which basically puts more burden on them and has nothing to do with the election of. I'm happy to get Raina and anyone else at the DNC the information they need. We work with her every single day. She knows what we're doing and we're not doing in the way of our voter protection programs. Let's fix the problem that we need to fix if there's a problem, if state parties aren't doing their part. But I want to be very clear. This is just a burden that is not necessary. It is a solution in search of a problem. Let's dig into the real work of actually protecting the vote instead of just checking a list and saying, well, we're asking state parties what they do in this document, parties who find this process exceedingly difficult. Guess what? Instead of doing the work that Luis is talking about, all next year, what are our state parties, especially the small ones, doing? They're spending a lot of their time, energy, and money on this document, trying to get it right, trying to do all the proof positive steps that are required in here, and it costs a lot of time and money, especially for those small state parties. That's all I'm trying to suggest, Donna.
And Ken, not to argue back, but those state parties is also key to our understanding of how the process is being developed in the state. So bear with us, and if it doesn't look like it's going to get off the shelf, I'll be the first to help you remove it from the menu next time. Well, if I'm around, you know, I gotta keep begging somebody to appoint me, you know.
Well, Ken, thank you for bringing up those very valuable points. Frank, thank you for entering this into the discussion. I think I'll now turn it back over to my co-chair for.
Parties can use as they draft their plan. This is the same document the party affairs staff will use when they review each state's delegate selection plan. You have a copy of the draft checklist in your materials. Staff will be finalizing the checklist and will include it in the documents that are provided to the state parties later this month. Once again, if you see any inconsistencies or potential improvements or typos, please let staff know as soon as possible. Any questions about the
over to our chair, who has some words he'd like to discuss.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to make sure, in particular, I emphasize in this process, because there has been a change. For a long time, as long as I've been aware of politics, Iowa was a crucial part in terms of how we did the selection process. Iowa, for the first time just recently, elected their first African of the past few years. Iowa just recently, Scott mentioned this earlier, and of course we know when I first became a state party chair, Scott Brennan was also the state party chair in Iowa, and we became good friends. And I know Carol has worked long with Scott when she was the chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party. Scott has given so much to this party, and we are so grateful and thankful for him as well. So thank you, Scott. And I want the folks in Iowa all had. It is because things have just changed. You have some of the best representatives to the DNC that I've ever met in any state. Ross and Scott poured their hearts into the effort to make sure that they made the best case for Iowa in this process. And I want folks in Iowa also to understand that this does not diminish your value as a state in what you bring on a level, on the state and legislative level. That commitment is unwavering. And so I just want to make sure that that is on record, that folks understand that this process, and we are all committed that in 4 years, we're going to revisit this whole thing all over again. And so Iowa and every other state that didn't get it this time will get an opportunity to tee it up one more time and put out the best path forward. So I just want the folks in Iowa to also just understand. You got some amazing people all over that great state. So Scott, Ross, thank you again for all you do, and all your DNC members from Iowa as well. Thank you again.
So, members, we've come to the end of our journey. I do have some good news. We don't have a meeting tomorrow. So thank you so much for all the hard work and the diligence. We are still having dinner. It's at 6:30. But before we leave, are there any questions that you have? We want to make sure you get it all.
Will we start reviewing plans?
I'll leave that to the staff.
Summer, are we looking spring or summer?
Yep, yes. So you got it. Yep, so our application deadline, or our delegate selection plan deadline is May 3rd. I'm sure we'll get some plans along the way, but our intention is to conduct a training at the upcoming ASDC meeting to help state parties learn to put these plans together, walk through the model plan with them, and some of the things we discussed today. At the end of the month, we'll be sending out the materials to them, additional materials that they would like to. We'll begin the process of receiving their materials in the spring, beginning with that letter of intent March 1st. They'll publicize their plans by April 3rd, and then by May 3rd is the deadline to submit them to us, and so after that point, unless we have them.
So it'll be next summer will be the very intense work period for us.
Yes.
Okay.
Like this summer.
Yeah, sorry.
So if we have no further questions, I want to,
This cycle, which was very useful to actually schedule the meetings well in advance, because we know when the plans are coming in, and then we can all make plans around that. That would be very helpful. Thanks.
any more questions? Well, I want to thank you again, and I want to make sure that my co-chair here is, if he wants to have a final word before we adjourn.
Well, I certainly want to thank all of you. I want to thank the wonderful staff of this great hotel. And the Secretary's office. And Mr. Chair, thank you for joining us in this process and for your important contributions to our understanding of where we are and where we're going. So, and I think we should also thank the President of the United States